Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're drifting back to the 1400s, the 15th century if you want to be precise about it, which most people living through it absolutely did not. This is one of those eras that gets romanticized constantly. Knights in shining armor, ladies in pointy hats, courtly love, all very Instagram-worthy, if Instagram had existed in a world without running water or antibiotics or any real understanding of why people kept dying of everything all the time. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe put your phone on silent, because we're going to meander through what life was actually like for people in the 1400s, with a particular focus on the royals and nobles, because their lives were both slightly better and exponentially weirder than everyone else's. And if you drift off halfway through someone's complicated succession crisis, well, that's exactly what we're here for. Let's start with the basics. The 1400s were, to put it gently, not a great time to be alive. The Black Death had recently finished killing about a third of Europe, give or take a few million people, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces in a world that suddenly had far too many empty houses and not nearly enough living people to work the fields. This created some interesting economic shifts that we won't dive too deeply into tonight, because nothing says restful sleep quite like medieval agrarian labor theory. But here's what you need to know. The 1400s were a time of transition. The Middle Ages were stumbling toward the Renaissance, though nobody living through it would have called it that. They were too busy dealing with wars, plagues, political upheaval, and the kind of casual violence that makes modern life seem almost gentle by comparison. Almost. Now, if you were royal or noble in the 1400s, your life was complicated. You had money, sure, land, maybe, power if you played your cards right, but you also had responsibilities, enemies, and a family tree that was less of a tree and more of a tangled shrub that kept looping back on itself in ways that would make a modern genealogist weep into their laptop. Let's talk about France first, because France in the 1400s was having what we might charitably call a moment. And by a moment, I mean the 100 Years' War, which was still dragging on like that one dinner party guest who doesn't understand when it's time to leave. England and France had been fighting on and off since 1337, and by the 1400s, everyone was exhausted, broke, and thoroughly sick of the whole thing. But they kept going anyway, because that's what you did in the 1400s. You committed to the bit. The French king for a good chunk of this period was Charles VI, who history remembers as Charles the Mad. And before you think that's some kind of ironic nickname, let me assure you, it was not. Charles was genuinely deeply unwell. He had his first breakdown in his early 20s, and it only got worse from there. During one episode, he became convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if anyone touched him. During another, he forgot he was married and didn't recognize his own wife. He once attacked his own knights during a forest outing because he briefly thought he was fighting off assassins. He did not have a relaxing reign. Now, you might think, surely someone stepped in to help this man, and you'd be right, sort of. The problem was that the people who helped were his relatives, who immediately began fighting among themselves for control of France, while Charles wandered around convinced he was fragile glassware. This infighting weakened France considerably, which England was more than happy to take advantage of. Nothing like a little internal dysfunction to make an invasion easier. Charles VI's son, the Dauphin, later Charles VII, had his own issues. For one thing, there were rumors that he wasn't actually Charles VI's biological son, which is the kind of thing that really complicates a claim to the throne. For another, he was, how do I put this gently, not exactly a natural leader. He was indecisive, anxious, and had the kind of face that inspired very little confidence. One contemporary described him having legs as thin as reeds, which feels unnecessarily specific, but does paint a picture. But then along came Joan of Arc, and things got briefly interesting. Joan was a peasant girl from Lorraine who started hearing voices, saints, she said, telling her to help the Dauphin take back France from the English. And because the 1400s were a time when people just sort of rolled with this kind of thing, she was eventually given an army and sent off to lift the siege of Orleans, which she did successfully at age 17. The story of Joan of Arc is famous enough that I won't recount every detail here. This is a sleep video, not a rousing battle epic. But the short version is, she helped turn the tide of the war, got the Dauphin crowned king, was later captured by the Burgundians, sold to the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. She was 19. The church later decided they'd made a whoopsie and declared her a martyr. Then, 500 years later, they made her a saint, which is nice, I suppose, if a bit late to be useful to Joan personally. Charles VII, for his part, did absolutely nothing to save her. Just let it happen. Didn't pay her ransom, didn't intervene at her trial, didn't even protest much. The woman who'd secured his throne died horribly, and he was mostly concerned with maintaining diplomatic relations with the people who killed her. Classy guy. Over in England, things were not much better, which is almost comforting in its consistency. Henry V, the one from the Shakespeare play, had been doing pretty well for himself. He'd won a stunning victory at Agincourt in 1415, married a French princess, and briefly made it look like England might actually win the 100 Years' War. Then he died of dysentery in 1422, because even kings in the 1400s were not immune to the fact that medieval hygiene was, shall we say, optional. Henry V's son, Henry VI, inherited the throne as a literal infant, 9 months old, which is not ideal for effective governance. Henry VI grew up to be pious, gentle, and completely unsuited for medieval kingship, which required you to be at least moderately okay with violence, warfare, and political ruthlessness. Henry VI was none of these things. He was more interested in founding colleges and praying than in actually ruling, which his nobles found deeply inconvenient. Henry VI also inherited his grandfather's mental illness. Charles VI was his maternal grandfather because, of course, the English royal family had married into the French royal family right before the French king started having episodes where he thought he was made of glass. Genetics are fun like that. Henry VI began having his own breakdowns in his 30s, including one where he became completely catatonic for over a year. Just stopped responding to anything, stared into space, did not king. This created a power vacuum, which the English nobility filled by starting a civil war. Because if there's one thing the 1400s loved more than a good plague, it was a succession crisis that could be solved with violence. Part 2. Roses, blood, and really bad family dynamics. So let's talk about the Wars of the Roses, which is the poetic name given to the series of English civil wars that dominated the latter half of the 1400s. It's called the Wars of the Roses because the two main factions, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, each had a rose as their symbol. Lancaster had a red rose, York had a white rose, and together they spent about 30 years intermittently murdering each other over who got to sit on the throne. Here's the thing about the Wars of the Roses. It was essentially a very prolonged, very bloody family argument. The Lancasters and the Yorks were both descended from Edward III, who'd ruled England in the 1300s and had the poor judgment to have too many sons who survived to adulthood. Those sons had children, and those children had children, and eventually you end up with multiple branches of the same family, all convinced they have the best claim to the throne. And because this is the 1400s, the way you settled that dispute was with armies. Henry VI, as we've established, was not great at the whole kingship thing. The House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York, looked at Henry's complete inability to rule effectively and thought, we could do better. Which, to be fair, was probably true. Richard of York was competent, experienced, and not prone to catatonic episodes. Unfortunately for him, being better qualified did not automatically make you king in the 1400s. There were rules. Complicated, often contradictory rules involving bloodlines and legitimacy, and who your great-great-grandfather was. Richard of York did not initially try to take the throne. He just wanted to be recognized as Henry VI's heir, which seemed reasonable given that Henry's mental health was declining and he'd only managed to produce one son after 9 years of marriage. That son, by the way, was Edward of Westminster, who we'll get to in a moment because his story is its own special kind of sad. But Henry VI's wife, Margaret of Anjou, was having none of it. Margaret was French, fiercely intelligent, and absolutely determined that her son would inherit the throne. She was everything Henry was not, strong-willed, politically savvy, and willing to do whatever it took to protect her family's interests, which is admirable in a way, except that whatever it took mostly involved armies and battles and a lot of people dying in muddy fields. The first major battle of the Wars of the Roses was the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, which the Yorkists won. Richard of York captured Henry VI, who was having one of his episodes at the time and probably didn't fully understand what was happening. For a few years, Richard acted as Lord Protector, essentially running the country, while Henry sat on the throne and gazed vaguely into the middle distance. But then Henry recovered. Sort of, and Margaret of Anjou convinced him to reassert his authority, which meant the fighting started up again. The whole thing descended into a cycle of battles, truces, more battles, and occasional beheadings. Medieval politics were nothing if not consistent. Richard of York himself died at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, which the Lancastrians won. Margaret of Anjou's forces captured him, killed him, cut off his head, and stuck it on a spike on the walls of York with a paper crown on top. Because if you're going to make a point, you might as well commit to the theatrics. Richard's death didn't end the conflict, though. It just meant his son, Edward, took over. Edward was tall, really tall, over 6 feet, which in the 1400s made him a literal giant, handsome, charismatic, and good at warfare. Basically, he was everything his father had been, but with better PR. Edward won the Battle of Towton in 1461, which remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Estimates put the death toll around 28,000 men, which for medieval warfare was genuinely staggering. The battle lasted all day in a snowstorm, and by the end, the nearby river was reportedly choked with corpses. Cheery stuff. After Towton, Edward IV declared himself King Edward IV. Henry VI fled, though he was eventually captured and locked in the Tower of London, where he mostly sat quietly and prayed, and probably wished he'd been born into literally any other family. Edward IV's reign started promisingly enough. He was popular, competent, and seemed to have things under control. Then he made a decision that can only be described as monumentally stupid even by 1400 standards. In 1464, Edward secretly married a woman named Elizabeth Woodville. Now, marrying in secret is already questionable when you're a king, but the real problem was who Elizabeth was. She was a commoner, well, minor nobility, but commoner enough that it mattered, and a widow with 2 sons from her previous marriage. She was Lancastrian by family allegiance, which meant Edward had just married into the faction he'd spent the last several years fighting. Edward's chief advisor and biggest supporter, the Warwick, the Earl of Warwick, known as Warwick the Kingmaker because he'd essentially put Edward on the throne, was furious. Warwick had been negotiating a French marriage alliance for Edward, and Edward had just torpedoed those plans by revealing he was already married to an Englishwoman no one had ever heard of. Warwick felt humiliated, betrayed, and extremely petty about the whole thing. So Warwick did what any self-respecting, overpowered noble would do. He switched sides. He abandoned Edward, allied with Margaret of Anjou, his former enemy, and helped put Henry VI back on the throne in 1470. This period is called the Redemption of Henry VI, which is a fancy way of saying that time they briefly made the mentally ill king again. It didn't last. Edward IV invaded England with an army, defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, where Warwick died, because of course he did, and then crushed Margaret of Anjou's forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir, was killed either during the battle or shortly after. The sources disagree on the details, but the outcome was the same. Dead prince, no more Lancastrian line. Margaret was captured and eventually ransomed.
Back to France, where she lived out her days in poverty and obscurity. Henry VI, meanwhile, died in the Tower of London shortly after Edward IV reclaimed the throne. The official story was that he died of melancholy, which is medieval code for, "we probably had him quietly murdered." Part 3. Edward IV and the Woodville Problem. So Edward IV was back on the throne, the Lancastrians were defeated, and everything should have been fine. Except it wasn't, because Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville, and Elizabeth Woodville came with baggage. Specifically, a large family that she immediately began promoting at court. Elizabeth had 2 sons from her previous marriage, 5 brothers, and 7 sisters, and she made it her mission to secure advantageous marriages and positions for all of them. This was not popular. The English nobility looked at this swarm of Woodvilles suddenly occupying all the best positions and marriages and felt deeply annoyed. It didn't help that Elizabeth herself was reportedly cold, haughty, and not particularly interested in winning people over. She knew she'd married the king, and she acted like it. Edward, for his part, was completely besotted with Elizabeth and gave her basically whatever she wanted, which is romantic, I suppose, until you realize that whatever she wanted often involved titles, lands, and power for her relatives at the expense of the older noble families who felt they deserved those things more. Edward and Elizabeth had 10 children together, which is impressive by any standard, but especially for a period when childhood mortality was high and childbirth could easily kill you. Their eldest son, another Edward, was born in 1470 and was immediately recognized as heir to the throne. Their second son, Richard, was born in 1473. And then there were a whole bunch of daughters, most of whom survived to adulthood and were married off to various noblemen in arrangements that benefited the Woodville family's interests. Edward IV himself, despite being good at warfare and kingship, had some personal habits that were, let's say, excessive. He loved food. Loved it, ate constantly, gained a significant amount of weight as he got older, to the point where contemporary accounts describe him as bloated and unrecognizable from his handsome youth. He also loved women who weren't his wife, which was common enough for kings, but still caused tension. Elizabeth Woodville was reportedly not thrilled about her husband's many mistresses, but there wasn't much she could do about it beyond glaring coldly in their general direction. Edward also had a brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who deserves his own mention because he was a special kind of disaster. George was everything you don't want in a royal sibling: ambitious, entitled, easily manipulated, and not quite smart enough to successfully betray people without getting caught. The final straw came when George's wife, Isabel, died in 1476, possibly related to complications related to childbirth. George became convinced she'd been poisoned and began making wild accusations at various people at court, including some of Elizabeth Woodville's relatives. He also started spreading rumors that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, which would make Edward's children illegitimate and potentially clear a path for George to inherit the throne. Edward IV had had enough. In 1478, George was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. The manner of his execution became famous. He allegedly was drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine, which is oddly specific and deeply weird. Some historians think this might be a myth, but it's too good a story not to mention, and frankly, it's exactly the kind of absurd detail that makes the 1400s the 1400s. With George out of the way, Edward's other brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became even more important. Richard was loyal, competent, and had spent years serving Edward faithfully in the north of England. He was short, noticeably short even for the time, and later sources would claim he had a hunchback or some kind of physical deformity, though it's hard to say how much of that is true and how much is Tudor propaganda. What we do know is that Richard was capable, serious, and completely devoted to his brother. Edward IV died suddenly in 1483 at the age of 40. The official cause was probably a stroke or a sudden illness, maybe pneumonia, maybe something else entirely. Medieval medicine wasn't great at diagnoses. What mattered was that Edward was dead, his heir was a 12-year-old boy, and England was about to descend into chaos. Again. Part 4. The Princes in the Tower and Richard III's Very Bad Year. When Edward IV died in April 1483, his eldest son, Edward V, was 12 years old. By medieval standards, 12 wasn't exactly a child, but it also wasn't old enough to rule effectively without guidance. Edward IV had named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, which meant Richard was supposed to govern on behalf of the young king until Edward V was old enough to take over properly. This should have been straightforward. It was not straightforward. The problem was the Woodvilles. Elizabeth Woodville and her family knew that if young Edward V came of age under Richard's guardianship, their influence would diminish. They wanted control of the new king, and they wanted it immediately. So they made plans to have Edward V crowned as quickly as possible before Richard could arrive in London from the north of England where he'd been governing. Richard found out about this plan and was not pleased. He intercepted Edward V on the boy's journey to London, arrested several of the Woodville relatives who were traveling with him, and took custody of the young king. Edward V was placed in the Tower of London, which at the time was a royal residence, not just a prison, so this wasn't as sinister as it sounds, yet. Elizabeth Woodville, seeing which way the wind was blowing, fled to Westminster Abbey with her daughters and her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. She claimed sanctuary, which the church was obligated to respect, and hunkered down to wait out whatever was about to happen.
What happened next is one of the most debated events in English history, and honestly, we're probably never going to know the full truth. So I'll just lay out what we do know and let you form your own conclusions in whatever dream you're about to have. Richard convinced, or coerced, depending on who you ask, Elizabeth Woodville to give up her younger son, Richard, so that the boy could join his brother in the Tower. The official reasoning was that Edward V needed his brother's company, and that it would be improper for the Duke of York to remain in sanctuary when he'd done nothing wrong. Elizabeth agreed, possibly because she didn't have much choice. So now both princes, Edward V, age 12, and Richard, Duke of York, age 9, were in the Tower of London under their uncle's control. And this is where things get dark, even by 1400 standards. In June 1483, a bishop named Robert Stillington came forward with a claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The reasoning was that Edward had allegedly been pre-contracted to marry another woman, Lady Eleanor Butler, before he'd married Elizabeth. And in medieval law, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage. If Edward's marriage to Elizabeth was invalid, then all their children were illegitimate and couldn't inherit the throne. This was obviously very convenient for Richard, and historians have been arguing for centuries about whether Stillington's claim was true or just a convenient excuse for a power grab. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that Parliament accepted the claim, declared Edward IV's children illegitimate, and offered the crown to Richard instead. Richard accepted. He was crowned King Richard III in July 1483. The two princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, remained in the Tower. And then, sometime over the next few months, they disappeared. No one knows exactly when or how the princes died. They were seen less and less frequently by Tower staff, and by the fall of 1483, no one was seeing them at all. Rumors spread that they'd been murdered, possibly smothered in their sleep, possibly killed in some other way. Richard III never produced the boys or explained what had happened to them, which did not help his public image. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen found a wooden box containing the skeletons of two children buried under a staircase. The bones were assumed to be the princes and were reburied in Westminster Abbey, where they remain. In 1933, the bones were examined and found to belong to two children roughly the right ages, but the analysis was inconclusive and is now considered outdated. The Church has refused requests for DNA testing, so we still don't know for certain if those bones belonged to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, or to some other unfortunate medieval children who happened to die in the Tower. What we do know is that Richard III's reputation never recovered. He was king for just over 2 years, and those 2 years were marked by rebellions, paranoia, and a general sense that things were not going well. Richard's own son and heir died in 1484, leaving Richard without a clear successor. His wife, Anne Neville, who had been Warwick's daughter and Richard's childhood companion, died in 1485, possibly of tuberculosis. Rumors spread that Richard had poisoned her so he could marry someone else, which he hadn't, but again, public relations were not Richard's strong suit. By 1485, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant who'd been living in exile in France, decided to invade England and claim the throne. He landed in Wales with an army, and Richard marched to meet him. They fought the Battle of Bosworth Field in August 1485, and Richard lost. Specifically, Richard died during the battle, reportedly fighting bravely in a final cavalry charge after his horse got stuck in marshy ground. His famous last words, or at least the famous last words Shakespeare gave him, were, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," which is almost certainly made up, but remains iconic nonetheless. Richard's body was stripped, slung over a horse, and brought back to Leicester, where it was buried in a Grey Friars church with minimal ceremony. The church was later demolished during the Reformation, and Richard's body was lost until 2012, when archaeologists found his skeleton under a parking lot. DNA testing confirmed it was Richard III, and he was finally reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, with significantly more pomp than he'd gotten the first time around. Part 5. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe. So that's England sorted, more or less, but the 1400s weren't just happening in England and France. The rest of Europe was busy having its own complicated, occasionally horrifying time, and we should check in on some of those places before you fall asleep entirely. Let's drift over to the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, nor much of an empire, but it did exist, and it did involve a lot of Germans arguing about who was in charge. The Holy Roman Emperor for much of the early 1400s was Sigismund of Luxembourg, who had the distinction of being King of Hungary, King of Germany, King of Bohemia, King of Italy, and Holy Roman Emperor, often simultaneously. Keeping track of all those titles was basically a full-time job.
Sigismund is mostly remembered for two things. First, his attempts to end the Great Schism in the Catholic Church, which was a situation where there were multiple popes all claiming to be the real pope and excommunicating each other in increasingly petty displays of ecclesiastical drama. Sigismund called the Council of Constance in 1414, which eventually resolved the schism by deposing all the competing popes and electing a new one that everyone could agree on. This was considered a major success, though it took 4 years and an enormous amount of political maneuvering to pull off. The second thing Sigismund is remembered for is betraying Jan Hus, a Czech religious reformer who had been promised safe conduct to attend the Council of Constance and defend his ideas. Hus showed up, was promptly arrested for heresy, and was burned at the stake in 1415. This outraged the people of Bohemia, who spent the next several years waging war against the Holy Roman Empire in what became known as the Hussite Wars. The Hussites were surprisingly good at warfare, despite being mostly peasants armed with farm implements and religious fervor. They developed innovative tactics involving wagons arranged in defensive formations and absolutely terrified the Catholic armies sent against them. Sigismund eventually regained control of Bohemia, but it took until 1436, and by then everyone was exhausted and a good portion of Bohemia had been devastated. Sigismund died in 1437, possibly relieved to finally be done with the whole thing. After Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor was Frederick III, who ruled for an astonishingly long time, from 1452 to 1493, and accomplished almost nothing of note. Frederick's main contribution to history was staying alive and not being dramatically murdered, which by 1400 standards was honestly an achievement. He also arranged for his son, Maximilian, to marry Mary of Burgundy, which brought a lot of valuable territory into the Habsburg family and set them up to dominate European politics for the next several centuries. But that was less about Frederick being a strategic genius and more about him being in the right place at the right time and not screwing up the marriage negotiations. Over in Spain, well, Spain didn't exist yet, not really. The Iberian Peninsula was divided into several kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Navarra, Portugal, and the Emirate of Granada, which was the last Muslim state in Iberia. The 1400s saw the gradual unification of Spain through a combination of marriage alliances, warfare, and religious enthusiasm. The big moment came in 1469, when Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon.
This marriage united two of the most powerful kingdoms in Iberia and set the stage for the creation of modern Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand were both ambitious, capable, and deeply, deeply Catholic in that particularly intense medieval way where you're convinced God is personally invested in your political decisions. Together, they completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort to drive Muslim rulers out of Iberia by conquering Granada in 1492. They also established the Spanish Inquisition in 1478, which was technically created to root out false converts to Christianity, but quickly became an instrument of terror, repression, and state control. The Spanish Inquisition was not a fun time for anyone involved, except possibly for Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, who seems to enjoy his work far too much. Isabella and Ferdinand also sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas in 1492, which had consequences we're all still living with, but that's technically outside the main thrust of this video, so we'll just note it and move on.